Chinese wine? You probably think, no way. But what if I tell you China has the oldest wine history in the world? What if I tell you that today China competes head-to-head with French wines? I'm Arsen Khachaturyants, probably one of the youngest winemakers in the world. Click the like button, subscribe to my channel, and let's open a bottle of history. When you think of wine, which countries come to mind? Most likely, your first thought is France. Bordeaux, Burgundy, Champagne, Provence. These regions have become almost mythic, etched into our collective memory as symbols of quality and tradition. But now, imagine this. In the middle of a Christianity-driven landscape, I bring up a country that doesn't share the Western ideology. A country built on entirely different values, where Confucius, Lao Tzu, and Buddha shaped hearts and minds, not Christ. We're talking about China and its bold, calculated, and unapologetic entry into the world of wine. The oldest known traces of alcoholic beverage production don't come from Europe, they come from China. In the Neolithic settlement of Zhaohu, in Henan province, archaeologists uncovered ceramic vessels dating back to around 7000 BC. Inside were remnants of fermented drink made from rice, honey, hawthorn fruit, and possibly grapes. It wasn't just any alcohol. It was, by all reasonable definitions, an early form of wine. It was the 1980s, and China was at the height of transformation, the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution. A 10-year-old period of political and social upheaval had left the nation isolated and economically stagnant. The system of central planning was failing to meet modern needs. A shift was not just necessary, it was urgent. That shift came with Deng Xiaoping, the reformist leader who took control after Mao Zedong's death. Though he never held the formal title of head of state, Deng launched a sweeping reorientation of the country in 1978. Opening China to foreign investments and loosening the constraints of central planning. It was a careful, balancing act, allowing market experimentation while maintaining the firm grip of the state oversight. Out of this climate of cautious liberalization came a series of state-supported industrial projects designed to tap into global demand. China began building what were, in essence, national startups aimed at export. One of the most surprising among them, wine. In 1983, a subsidiary of massive state-owned China National Cereals, Oils and Foodstuffs Corporation was launched. For decades, this agro-industrial giant had handled basic commodities like grain and oil. Now it was launching China Great Wall Wine, the country's first major winemaking company. The symbolism was impossible to miss. The new wine enterprise was established at the foot of a Great Wall, near Guanyin Lake, a location deeply rooted in national pride. The message was clear. This was more than a business venture. It was a statement of intent, linking China's Asian heritage to its modern ambitions. This was the beginning of a big game. But how was such rapid progress in a completely unfamiliar field even possible? We knew that prior to 1983, China had no large-scale wine production to speak of. And yet today, the country produces over 50,000 tons of wine annually and exports to more than 20 countries, including the United States, France, Germany, and the UK. So, is such a leap achievable in just 40 years? A blink of an eye by the slow-moving standards of the wine industry, a clear goal and, most importantly, strategic borrowing of foreign technologies and talents. Unlike the French, who see themselves not just as market leaders, but as cultural stewards, constantly innovating and creating from scratch, China in the 1980s had different priorities. The goal wasn't originality, it was market entry and export profit. And for that, China Great Wall Wine wasn't shy about its methods. They imported everything they could from Europe: fermentation tanks, pneumatic presses, oak barrels, and temperature control systems, mostly from France, Germany, and Italy. No expenses were spared. They weren't trying to reinvent the wheel. They were trying to make it spin fast and smoothly. But hardware wasn't enough. China also hired French consultants, seasoned professionals from Bordeaux, to train its first generation of winemakers in the techniques and philosophy of European viticulture. At the time, their Western partners viewed the project with polite condescension. Nobody in France or Italy seriously considered China a future competitor. When China Great Wall wine launched, few believed it would thrive. Meanwhile, the Chinese, in keeping with their tradition of quiet perseverance, didn't make bold claims. They studied, they listened, and they learned. Over the next 15 years, production steadily grew. Great Wall wine expanded to 4 provinces, scaled up operations, and refined its craft using the best of European technology and expertise. But by the mid-90s, a strange paradox began to emerge. There was wine, but there were no drinkers. On one hand, domestic demand simply didn't exist. Most Chinese consumers had no cultural reference for wine, no understanding of what it was or why they should drink it. On the other hand, foreign markets weren't interested either. Not only did other countries already have their own wine industries, but Chinese wine still seemed too exotic, too unfamiliar for the average global consumer. China, however, approached the issue with a scale and decisiveness characteristic of its political system. It launched a state-level strategic campaign that combined the machinery of government propaganda with modern marketing strategies borrowed from the West. China Great Wall wine wasn't just a product, it was a national project, a symbol of modernization, progress, and cultural pride. There was no room for half measures. The state went all in, building a strong visual identity, introducing digital technology, and initiating a national dialogue with consumers. Step 1. Education. Branding efforts focused on national pride and cultural symbolism. Marketers began building connection between a traditionally Western beverage and unmistakably Eastern imagery. The Great Wall of China appeared prominently on labels. Television, radio, and billboards across the country echoed poetic slogans like "true wine" and "natural link to the spirit." The approach may seem confusing to Western audiences, used to clear-cut, benefit-driven advertising, but China remained true to its cultural lens. Even while adopting Western technologies, the spirit of the wine was framed through the values and language of Eastern tradition. At the same time, China began actively participating in international wine exhibitions. The West, which had initially scoffed at the idea of Chinese wine, started to take notice. As the wine world opened up to new players like Chile, Australia, and New Zealand, China's presence no longer seemed out of place. The mission was clear and partially accomplished. China had secured its place at the table. By the early 2000s, China was on a clear economic upswing. A new middle class was emerging, ambitious, globally curious, and increasingly oriented toward a Western lifestyle, yet still committed to growing and thriving within China itself. At the same time, wine exports from so-called exotic countries like Chile, Australia, and South Africa were rising steadily. And suddenly, China had something it lacked before: its own domestic consumer, a new kind of Chinese Westerner, and a growing flicker of international interest. Sensing the opportunity, China Great Wall wine went all in. They hired star consultants from France, including legendary enologist Michel Rolland, launched premium lines like the 5-star G series aimed at duty-free zones, and expanded exports into the US, Canada, and Southeast Asia. By the 2010s, with solid production and sales volume under their belt, Chinese wine companies began doing something once unthinkable: buying vineyards in France. Producing wine in the so-called homeland of wine wasn't just a financial play, it was an image strategy. The goal was to elevate the brand while still preserving a distinctly Eastern identity. Meanwhile, the elite segment of the industry continued to mature. Thanks to their strategic lobbying, Chinese producers began appearing at major international events like Wine Expo, ProWine, and the Decanter World Wine Awards. This wasn't just about prestige, it was about being taken seriously in global wine circles. And it worked. Chinese wines started appearing in international ratings and wine lists, while duty-free retail expanded and partnerships with Southeast Asian hotels were solidified. Today, China Great Wall Wine alone operates 4 major vineyards across China, exports widely to both West and the East, maintains a production capacity of around 50,000 tons per year. But the story doesn't stop with one company. In recent years, production in Ningxia, a region some now call the next Bordeaux, has exploded. Dozens of wineries, both large and small, are thriving there. Among them are rising stars like Helen Kingsway and the local branch of Domaine Chandon, a name that carries serious international weight. And it's not just about volume. China is making quite strides in quality too. In a major breakthrough, Jia Beilan, a wine from Ningxia, won a gold medal at the Decanter World Wine Awards. It may not compete with the French in scale or reputation yet, but when you consider the timeline, this is an extraordinary accomplishment. All of these successes and setbacks alike reflects a deeper story. Since the 1980s, China hasn't simply been selling a product. It has been presenting the world with a renewed image of a republic. Emerging from decades of political isolation and recovering from a cultural revolution, Chinese officials, marketers, and innovators are sending a message. Our path is just as valid as yours. We can make wine. We can build our own brands. We can sell our bottles in your airports, on your wine lists, at the same price as yours. We are modern. We are competitive. We are ambitious. China is no longer content to follow.